Review of Pivot Point by Casey West. This is another book that I wanted to talk about because it is an excellent example of the use of story braiding. It also happens that I just love this book. I love it so much. It's a fun book. It's young adult science fiction romance, so it doesn't have the huge depth of story or tear-jerkiness of a very literary science fiction story or a very epic fantasy, but for a young adult book, it's one of my favorites of the genre. I don't know why, I love this book so much. I just think it's so perfectly done. There's a sequel, and the sequel is also very good, and if you want to end the series, I think it's just a duology. If you want to end the series with a happy ending, you have to read the sequel. If you want to read a tragedy, you could just end with this book. I guess that's a little bit of a spoiler for the ending, but I won't tell you why. I will say that as a duology, it has a happy story arc, but if you stop it after the first book, then you could read it as a standalone tragic story, and it really works either way. It just depends on how much of a glutton for punishment you are. So as usual, or as I'm trying to make my usual, I will first describe a quick summary of the book for those who think they might be interested in it, and then if you don't want spoilers, stop the review before you read the rest. If you've already read it, or if you don't mind about spoilers, then keep going because I am going to talk about the entirety of the book from a writing perspective to discuss what worked and what didn't, why I like this book so much, why I just thought it was just like a perfect little gem of a book, and also why story braiding was such an efficient and wonderful method for writing this book. First of all, the premise. The premise here is that there are people, human beings, with paranormal abilities. The government knows about them, but they hide them from the rest of the world. All of the people with paranormal abilities live in a secret city somewhere in Texas, hidden from the rest of humanity by some kind of paranormal illusion. But within that secret city, they basically live a fairly normal life. The only difference between their world and ours is that their technology is somewhat more advanced because a lot of people there use their paranormal powers to develop technology, which is in advance of what we have in ordinary existence. People's paranormal ability develops sometime in their teenage years, and so for the children here, a big part of their life is finding out what their abilities are and training to use them in high school the same way that we would take other academic classes. That isn't really the focus of the book, however. The book's storyline really begins when the heroine is confronted by her parents with the talk, and the parents explain that the mom and dad can't get along, it's not your fault, and they're gonna get divorced. It's gonna have bigger than usual consequences. Well, I guess divorce always has big consequences, doesn't it? But it's going to have big consequences for her because her father is going to live in the outside world, hidden as a norm, which means that he has to hide a lot of his abilities and so on from the people around him, but he's chosen to live in the outside world, just in a regular town, and her mother is going to stay in the paranormal town and continue to live the paranormal existence where she, even though they're hidden from the rest of the world, she can basically be herself when she's in that town. And the parents give their teenage daughter the choice between which parent she wants to live with. I loved this setup right from the start because it took a very ordinary situation, a common situation that a teenager might find themselves in where their parents are getting divorced and they have to choose between them, and then it added the paranormal layer so that for her there's the fantasy or science fiction layer on top of a normal situation, and the normal situation is what provides the emotional punch to it because you can relate to the idea of you having to choose between your mother and your father. And I think that emotionally you could imagine what it's like to have to make that choice even if your parents aren't divorced. And of course, if you have divorced parents, it's even more of an emotional twist in the gut. But then on top of it, you have the paranormal story, and then that makes it just a little more interesting, at least to me, than just an ordinary contemporary story about divorce or about a teenager dealing with divorce. Just as an aside, in my review of Orville episode 8, Into the Fold, I believe it was, I went on a little bit of a rant about how I don't like divorce being treated in a trivial or casual manner in a story. Then that would apply to single parenthood as well. So you may be wondering, well, what about in this story? I think that in this story, it's taken really seriously. It's taken as something that is tearing a family apart. I don't mind dealing with an issue with the suitable gravitas that the issue deserves, and I feel like this story treats divorce as a terrible event in the life of a teenager, and therefore or I didn't have a problem with it. It was interesting to see how is she going to deal with this. And there's not going to be, this is not really a spoiler because I think you could see this coming. There's no easy, happy ending to the divorce storyline. That part is kept very realistic. It's just something that just happens, and sometimes it just sucks. And if you're the teenager and not the parent, you don't have any control over it. So I'd also like to talk about how I think this is something to really keep an eye on, and it's a really good technique, especially in young adult fiction, and especially in paranormal fiction, where it's magic or science fiction set in an almost near contemporary situation, like superhero stories. These are paranormal people, but it's kind of like having superpowers. And that is to keep your storyline close to the normal human experience, as close as you can. You make it somewhat analogous or metaphorical. Now, that doesn't mean you treat it as not true. I'm not really a fan of magical realism, and one reason is because in magical realism, a lot of magical realism, it seems that the paranormal ability or the magical ability is treated too openly as a metaphor. For me, that's almost like breaking the fourth wall, wink, wink at the reader. And I don't like that. That's why I don't like magical realism. I like it to be that it's clearly magical, not metaphorical or not merely literary. It's not just the author showing off to the reader and winking at the reader. So I prefer absolute straight fantasy or straight science fiction over magical realism, because I feel like you can still get that metaphorical level to the story simply by the nature of the story. You're putting the magic element in the story, and you're putting the human element in the story, the ordinary element in the story, and simply by juxtaposing them, you create the metaphor simply by having them side by side in the story. But you do have to watch what your metaphors are doing and what you are metaphorically saying. I read a story once where the heroine used her magic to accidentally kill 30 children. And then the heroine just went on with her life like that was not a problem. And I just thought, well, that metaphorically means your heroine is a mass murderer. A mass murderer of children. That's really awful, and you should deal with that. You can't just throw that in there as if it doesn't matter. To me, that's like either you're not taking the murder seriously or you're not taking the magic seriously. Your character has done something with the magic that is just as serious as if they hadn't used magic at all. So that's something that you really have to watch. You have to ask yourself, if you removed the magical or the scientific element from your story and simply had the character behave that way in real life, would that be an action that you could support? And I've seen authors go wrong on this, especially in vampire stories, where the heroine falls in love with some handsome, snarky vampire, and he's killed hundreds of people, but she doesn't care that he's a mass murderer. And I just find that really disturbing, because I would care, and I can't fall in love with a character that is a mass murderer, and I don't care if it's because he's a vampire. He has to at least have come to terms with his behavior or something like that. Anyway, so back to this story. Sorry for the aside. In this story, it's handled very well, and everything that she does with her paranormal ability, if you take away the paranormal element and you ask if she did this just as an ordinary person, would it still make sense? Yes, it would still make sense. And so to me, that's a mark of a good paranormal story. There's one other element that's really important to this story, and that sets up the entire scenario for the story braiding. And that is the paranormal ability of the main character. It explains the title of the book, Pivot Point. The heroine has the ability to see into the future, but she does it in a very specific way. In fact, her talent is not called clairvoyant, it's called divergent. And remember, I think this book came out before the book Divergent. So the author uses it here in a way that is unique to this book and doesn't have anything to do with that other series. Basically, she can examine two different paths. If she makes a binary decision, one is to go with her father in this case, or go with her mother. And she's used this talent before, but she's never used it to such an extent as she needs to use it now. She wants to look 6 weeks into the future. So she and her best friend sit down and decide she's going to use her ability, and she's going to look into the future. And the parents know about her ability. In fact, that's why they gave her the choice, because they knew she would use her ability to look into the future to make her decision. So the setup of this story takes place in chapter 1 and chapter 2. And then in chapter 3, we begin the two diverging storylines, and we see every other chapter is her living one possible life, and the alternate chapters are her living another possible life, covering 6 weeks of the school year. Since it is a young adult story, of course, the two divergent storylines end up with her meeting two different boys and becoming involved in two different relationships. So it becomes not only a choice of which parent she wants to live with, but which boy she wants to be with. She's also experiencing life in two different worlds. One, she continues to live in her paranormal town, and in the other one, she goes out into the norm world and lives among the normies. In one story, she gets to stay with her best friend. In the other storyline, she has to go into this new town and make new friends and perhaps new enemies. I highly, highly recommend this book if you like young adult books. So if you want to not have any spoilers, you should definitely stop the video now, come watch it another time, and come back and tell me what you think, if you liked it too, what you think about the book. But I highly recommend it. Pivot Point by Casey West. You should stop now and go buy it if you don't like spoilers. Okay, now comes the second half of the review where I am going to talk about the writing of the book, and this will include spoilers all the way up to the end. As I said, she starts in chapter 3 with alternating every chapter between the two possible futures that not Casey West, I'm sorry, that's the author, that the protagonist can experience. If you get lost by any chance, all the odd numbered chapters are one storyline and all the even numbered chapters are another storyline. I know as a writer that can actually help me remember where I am in a story. Visually, the author has also taken into account how this might show up in a movie, which I also liked, because very early on the heroine gets a different haircut in the alpha storyline than in the beta storyline. So in the alpha storyline, she gets a streak of color in her hair and she changes the shape of it. She straightens it and gets it colored. Whereas in the other one, she has it loose and curly. So if we were to see it visually on a screen and even visually in your mind, this really helps you distinguish between the character as she starts to change in the two storylines. One of the interesting things about the character's ability is that for her, she experiences both memories. Even after she's made her decision about which path she's going to choose, she experiences both memories as real. And this causes trouble for her sometimes. In the paranormal city where the alpha storyline takes place, she had previously used her ability to check out the answer to a question by a boy at her school when he asked her out to a dance. Up until the point that the novel begins, that was the longest time she'd ever gone. She'd gone an entire week into the future to check out how things would go after the dance, and she found out that after the dance he took her into his house alone in the dark and tried to make a move on her against her will. So she reacted to him very strongly. Of course, she chose not to go to the dance with him because he tried to date rape her. But she can't explain to him what he did to her. She doesn't want to come out with it because to her it feels like it happened, that he did it. But as her best friend reminds her, well, he didn't actually do it. It didn't actually happen for him, so he doesn't know what he's guilty of. And so that's one of the consequences of her ability, is that she remembers everything just as real as her real memories, the memory of the path that she takes. She remembers the path not taken as if it had already happened as well. It's just as vivid to her. And that's a really important thing to remember too when you're reading this book, because it gives everything that extra emotional angst. One of the advantages of the way that the entire book is set up and the way that the paranormal universe is set up is that, of course, there's a love triangle, but there's not really a love triangle as the boys in the love triangle experience it. And in fact, while she's experiencing each separate timeline, she doesn't experience it either. But the reader knows that she's going to eventually have to make a choice between these two boys that she meets. So the reader experiences the love triangle, but for the heroine and the guys that she's dating, there's no love triangle. I think that's so clever. And again, one of the problems I have with love triangles is, how can you not know who you're in love with? Or are you playing along? Are you, toying or teasing with the boys and not being honest with them, dating two boys at the same time? But you don't have a problem when you do it paranormally, like in this book. So I think that's really cool. The other thing that this parallel storyline shows us is a lot of these same events happen. Her school in the paranormal city has a football game against the school in the normal city. And in both cases, she meets a football player. And one, she's dating a football player on the paranormal football team. And the other one, she is dating a normie guy who used to be on the football team but was injured. And you start to see the difference in her experiences. There's an incident when the two teams come together to play a game against each other. When she's in the paranormal team, her friend says, oh, let's go play pranks on the normies. And she's like, yeah, that sounds like fun. Let's do it. Whereas when she's been living in the normal town and she's gotten to know them and realize they're human beings just like us, we shouldn't look down on them just because they don't have paranormal abilities. And she meets up with her friend that she hasn't seen in a couple of weeks in this timeline. And her friend says, oh, let's go play pranks on the normies. And she says, no, don't do that. Come on, don't do that. So you see the different kinds of emotional and moral growth that she makes depending on which timeline that she chooses. And in a sense, she becomes a better person when she goes into the normie world because she's forced to confront something that is much more different than she has ever experienced. She's forced to confront her sort of bigotry against the normies that she experienced growing up, being told all the time she's so special. She has these abilities that make her better than other people. Now she's forced to confront that and realize, well, she's not really better than other people. Being paranormal, having a a paranormal ability doesn't make you better than normie people. So in a sense, she is growing more as a person in one timeline than she is in the other timeline. And the further we go into the storyline, the more we begin to sympathize with her choice to go with the normie world, in part because the guy she meets there, she makes a connection with that is so much deeper and more real than the guy she is dating in the other world. We see that in the paranormal world, she's dating somebody who's really popular, who seems to like her, but it's very shallow relationship. It doesn't have a lot of depth to it. A lot of times she's questioning it, but then she falls back into it. And we begin to sense that she's not really in love with this guy. She's more with him because of expectations or because of some other reason. Whereas the connection she's making with the normie guy is much deeper and much more personal, and she begins to clearly fall in love with him. At the same time that this storyline is going, there is also a murder mystery. So it's a secondary or even tertiary plot, but it's in the background and it is crucial to the plot line. She's not really the investigator for the murder mystery. Her father is, and that's true in both timelines. But when she's in the paranormal timeline, she sees it sort of from a distance, and when she's in the timeline where she's living with her father, she sees him investigating it up close. But he's investigating a murder that took place in the paranormal city. So some of the evidence that she gets in one timeline, she gets different evidence in the other timeline, and she doesn't have all the evidence that she needs to pull it together until the two timelines converge. And this is where the ending comes together and is really well done, because all the angst and all the storylines, the romance, the science fiction element, and the mystery all come together. She finds out in one timeline who the murderer is because he kills her best friend. This is the timeline, unfortunately, that is the best one for her. She's not there with her best friend to save her life, and so in the very timeline where she meets the boy that really is her soulmate, that she loves and that she wants to be with, and the one which is better for her as an individual because she grows more as an individual, unfortunately that timeline is the one where her best friend dies. And the other timeline where she stays in the paranormal city with her mom, and her friend ends up cheating on her and betraying her personally, and her boyfriend, she finds out, has betrayed her because he has used his magical or his paranormal ability on her, and that's why she was with him. It wasn't really from her at all, and that's why the relationship felt off, because he was using his extremely magical charisma to force her to be with him. So it's the worst possible timeline for her personally, but in a sense, it ironically, because her friend betrays her by cheating with her boyfriend on her, that is why the friend doesn't get killed by the person who turns out to be the murderer. So when she recovers back in her bedroom, now neither timeline of the 6 weeks has taken place, and now she has to choose between the two timelines. And so this is such a great ending. That's what I mean about it's a tragic ending, because she has to make the choice against her own self-interest, against the person that she loves, that she's fallen in love with, in order to save her friend's life, even though she will then be betrayed by the very friend. So she's making more than just the sacrifice of the person she loves and the life that is better for her. She's allowing her friend to betray her trust in this deep level to save her life. And it's, oh my gosh, the feels. It was such a great ending, and it was so powerful. Furthermore, unlike normally, she can't remember both timelines, because if she remembers both, she won't be able to act in the presence of the person who turns out to be the murderer, because it's somebody she knows. She won't be able to act normally around that person. She'll know it's a murderer. So she has to have her friend, who, a little conveniently, her friend's ability is the ability to erase memory. Her friend erases one of the timelines. So the setup for book 2 is that the boy that she fell in love with says, please just promise me that if you choose the other timeline, you don't forget me. But she has to forget him to save her friend's life. So she asks her friend, please find a way to, in the other timeline, you found a way to bring back memory. Please, in 6 weeks, bring back my memory. So she just needs 6 weeks of oblivion before she can get her memories back. So I did read book 2. It was also very good. In a lot of senses, I think the first book was better, but I'm glad I read the second book because it had a happy ending for the whole duology. I'll review that book as well. It was called Split Second. It also uses story braiding, and it uses it in a slightly different way, so it's also worth discussing about story braiding as a technique. I'll also do a video on story braiding, and I will discuss this book and 1 or 2 other books in that video. That's going to be more of a writing tip video. My own series, the Unfinished Song series, which is a 12-book series, but I'm up to book 7 was published. Right now I'm working on book 8. If you want to read that, I am going to have all the books on sale for 99 cents for the entire month of December. Well, or at least up to Christmas. So most of the month of December. So if this is a great time to buy the series, if you would like to try it out, you will see that I don't necessarily take all the advice that I give other writers in my books. I'm certainly not a perfect writer, but I hope that it does have some things that are fun and enjoyable if you like fantasy with a strong romance. It's definitely an epic fantasy, and I have multiple points of view. It's third person past tense. I do use story braiding in this series as well, so that's one of the reasons I like to talk about the technique. So check that out if you like. For the month of December, all my books going to be on sale for 99 cents. Tara out.